December 15, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Snow fell thick through skeletal trees as American convoy trucks ground their way along frozen roads, their engines straining against the cold. In the back of one truck, Private First Class James Carter sat hunched against the wooden slats, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. The temperature had dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that metal burned skin on contact, and every breath felt like inhaling knives. Around him, replacement troops destined for the front huddled in their greatcoats, silent and nervous. Carter was the only black soldier among them. He had no way of knowing that in less than 2 hours, the same men who wouldn't meet his eyes would be screaming his name, begging for help that only he could provide. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how one man's specialized training, dismissed and ridiculed by those around him, became the single thread separating life from catastrophe when the forest erupted in fire and the carefully ordered world of the American advance dissolved into chaos. It is a story about the moment when all the artificial divisions that separated men melted away in the face of bleeding wounds and desperate need, leaving only the raw human imperative to survive. James Carter had enlisted in Philadelphia in 1943, one of approximately 900,000 African-American men who served during the conflict. Unlike most, he had completed specialized combat medical training at Fort Sam Houston in Texas, 16 weeks of intensive instruction that covered everything from field surgery to treating shock under fire. The program was grueling, designed to produce medics who could function in the absolute worst conditions imaginable. Out of 120 men who started the course with Carter, only 68 completed it. The instructors had been surprised by his aptitude. Carter had worked as an apprentice to a veterinarian before the draft, and his hands knew the feel of living tissue, the geography of anatomy, the precise movements required when seconds mattered. He could tie a tourniquet in 7 seconds, pack and dress an abdominal wound in under 2 minutes, stabilize a compound fracture in less than 90 seconds. These were skills measured and tested under simulated combat conditions, with instructors firing blanks overhead and setting off explosives nearby to create the chaos of actual engagement. But the segregated military had different plans. Despite his qualifications, despite scoring in the top 5% of his training class, Carter had been assigned to a quartermaster unit, moving supplies and digging latrines. For 11 months, his medical kit gathered dust while he hauled ammunition crates and unloaded trucks at depots in England and France. It was a waste that burned at him constantly, knowing that men were dying who might be saved if only his hands were allowed to do the work they had been trained for. He watched other medics, some with half his training, get assigned to combat units while he stacked boxes and drove supply trucks. Then came December, and the sudden, desperate need for replacements. The German offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge had torn a 50-mile gap in Allied lines. 3 full American divisions had been shattered in the opening 72 hours. Every available soldier was being rushed forward, specialties and assignments suddenly fluid in the face of crisis. When you're bleeding out, nobody cares about the peacetime regulations anymore. They care about who can stop the bleeding. Carter found himself in that truck, heading toward Malmedy, reassigned to a rifle company that had lost 30% of its strength in the opening days of fighting. The company had started the month with 190 men. Now it was down to 133, with more wounded every day. The other replacements were young, most barely 20 years old. They had trained at infantry centers stateside, learned to fire rifles and dig foxholes and march in formation, but few had medical training beyond the most basic first aid. They knew how to apply a bandage and maybe inject morphine if someone walked them through it, but nothing more sophisticated than that. Carter carried his medical bag along with his rifle, the familiar weight a small comfort against the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The soldier next to him, a lanky private named Kowalski from Cleveland, finally broke the silence that had held since they left the staging area. "What's with the bag, boy? You a medic or something?" Carter kept his voice level, a skill learned through countless similar encounters over the past 2 years of service. "Combat medical training, Fort Sam Houston, 16 weeks. Kowalski snorted. glancing at the others with a smirk that invited them to share in the joke. "Hear that, fellas? We got ourselves a colored doctor." The mockery in his voice was clear, the emphasis on the last word dripping with sarcasm and disbelief. To Kowalski, and men like him, the idea of a black man with advanced medical training was somehow absurd, a pretension that needed to be knocked down. Another replacement, a stocky farm boy named Hendricks, who had thick hands and the permanent squint of someone who had grown up in bright prairie sunlight, joined in. "My daddy always said you people were good at shining shoes and carrying bags. Never heard of one playing doctor, though. What did they do, let you practice on dead pigs?" Several of the others laughed, the sound harsh in the enclosed space of the truck. Carter said nothing. He had learned that silence was often the best response. Let them talk. Let them assume. Let them build their little fortress of superiority. It didn't change what he knew, didn't diminish the skills in his hands or the knowledge in his head. He focused instead on checking his gear, running through mental inventories that had become second nature during training. Morphine syrettes 12, sulfur powder 4 packets, bandages, gauze, tourniquets, scalpel, forceps, needle and catgut for sutures. His fingers moved automatically, confirming each item by touch without looking, the way a pianist knows their keys. The truck hit a rut, and everyone lurched sideways, shoulders slamming into each other. Through gaps in the canvas cover, Carter could see the forest pressing close on both sides, dark and infinite, the trees so thick that the snow hadn't even reached the ground in some places. Somewhere ahead, artillery rumbled like distant thunder, a constant bass note underlying everything. The front was getting closer with every mile they covered. Sergeant Donnelly, a career soldier with 15 years of service and a face like worn leather, sat near the tailgate smoking a cigarette, despite the cold and the regulations against it. He had watched the exchange with tired eyes, but said nothing. Donnelly had seen enough of the military's contradictions to waste energy on reform. He had watched good men die and bad men get promoted. He had seen bravery ignored and cowardice rewarded. His job was to get these replacements to the company alive and functional. Everything else was someone else's problem, and Donnelly had learned long ago not to borrow trouble. The convoy slowed, then stopped. Voices shouted up and down the line, the words muffled by canvas and falling snow. Carter heard the metallic sounds of weapons being checked, safeties clicking, bolts being pulled back to verify rounds were chambered. Donnelly stood, gripping the truck's frame for balance, his cigarette dangling from his lip. "Listen up. We're half a mile from the company position. Road's too exposed from here, so we walk the rest of the way through the trees. Stay in file, 5-yard intervals. No talking, no smoking, no noise whatsoever. The forest is full of German patrols, and they know these woods better than we do. They've been operating in this area for weeks. We're the newcomers here. Remember that. Questions?" No one spoke. Fear had settled over the group like the falling snow, heavy and cold and inescapable. This was it. The abstract concept of combat was about to become concrete reality. They dismounted in shuffling, awkward movements, boots crunching on frozen ground that sounded impossibly loud in the forest silence. Carter slung his rifle and adjusted his medical bag, settling it high on his shoulder where the weight would distribute properly. The bag was heavy, nearly 30 pounds of supplies and equipment, but he had carried it through training marches of 20 miles and more. This was nothing compared to those exercises. The file moved into the trees, Donnelly at point, with a compass held close to his face, checking bearings every 50 yards. Visibility dropped to maybe 50 yards in the snow and gathering dusk, sometimes less when the trees grew thick. Carter found himself in the middle of the column, Kowalski ahead, Hendricks behind. No one spoke. The only sounds were breathing, footsteps, the whisper of falling snow hitting cloth and metal. Every noise seemed amplified, echoing in the cathedral silence of the winter forest. 20 minutes into the march, a sound froze everyone in place. Engines, vehicle engines, heavy and throaty and powerful, somewhere to the east. The sound carried strangely in the cold air, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. Donnelly raised a fist and the column dropped, men pressing into the snow behind whatever cover they could find. Carter lay behind a fallen log, heart hammering against his ribs. Those engines had a distinctive sound, different from American vehicles. Deeper, more guttural. The unmistakable sound of German armor, probably half-tracks or light tanks moving on a parallel road. The sound grew closer, then gradually faded north, the engines Dopplering away into the distance. Donnelly waited 5 full minutes before rising, a sign of his experience. Inexperienced soldiers would have moved as soon as the sound faded. Veterans knew that sometimes patrols doubled back, trying to catch anyone who broke cover too soon. When Donnelly finally signaled to continue, tension had ratcheted up another notch. This was enemy territory now, contested ground where survival meant constant vigilance and a little bit of luck. They had covered another quarter-mile when the world exploded. The first mortar round hit 30 yards ahead, a crack of thunder that Carter felt in his chest, and a geyser of frozen earth and snow that rose 20 feet in the air. Donnelly disappeared in the blast, simply there 1 second and gone the next. Before Carter could process what was happening, more rounds fell in rapid succession, walking back along the column with methodical precision. The distinctive crump, crump, crump of German mortars firing in sequence from a position probably half a mile away. Someone had called in their location, probably the patrol they had heard, marking their movement and radiating coordinates to supporting units. Men scattered in all directions, screaming, diving for cover, some freezing in place out of pure shock. Carter threw himself behind a thick spruce as the ground erupted around him. Snow and dirt rained down, mixed with pieces of bark and shredded vegetation. His ears rang from the concussion, a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else. Another round hit to his left, then another behind. The Germans had them bracketed, a kill box of exploding shells that chewed up the forest floor. The barrage lasted 90 seconds that felt like hours, then silence, broken only by moaning, and the soft hiss of snow hitting hot metal fragments that were embedded in trees and ground. Smoke drifted through the forest, acrid and chemical. Carter lifted his head carefully, taking stock of the situation with the clinical detachment that training had drilled into him. Assess, prioritize, act. The column had been shattered, men scattered across a 100-yard stretch of forest. Immediately visible were at least 4 wounded, probably more hidden in the trees or behind cover. Kowalski lay 15 feet away, clutching his leg and screaming, his voice raw and high-pitched with pain and shock. Further up, someone called weakly for help, the voice already thready and fading. Near where Donnelly had been standing, Carter could see a motionless form, partially covered by displaced earth. Combat medical training took over, overriding fear and uncertainty. This was what he had prepared for, what all those hours of instruction and practice had been building toward. Carter moved low and fast to Kowalski, his bag already open, hands reaching for the supplies he knew were there without having to look. The private's left leg was torn open from knee to ankle, the fabric of his trousers shredded and soaked with blood that steamed in the cold air. More critically, blood was pumping in rhythmic spurts from a deep laceration on the inner thigh. Femoral artery. If not controlled within minutes, Kowalski would bleed out right here in this frozen forest. Oh God, I'm dying," Kowalski gasped, his face white with shock, his pupils dilated. His hands scrabbled uselessly at the wound, smearing blood without actually applying effective pressure. Carter's hands moved with practiced precision. Tourniquet first, pulled from his bag and wrapped around the thigh above the wound. He twisted it tight until the spurting stopped, then secured it with the metal clasp. "You're not dying. Look at me. Look at my eyes." He forced Kowalski to focus, grabbing the man's face and making direct eye contact, breaking the spiral into panic that could be as deadly as the wound itself. "I'm going to fix this, but you need to stay calm. Can you do that?" Kowalski nodded, teeth chattering from shock and cold. Carter worked fast, packing the wound with gauze, wrapping it tight with bandages to maintain pressure and protect the damaged tissue. A morphine syringe into the shoulder, the small tube of pain relief that would help counter shock. He pinned the empty syringe to Kowalski's collar so any following medic would know the dosage and time. The entire process took 90 seconds, every movement economical and purposeful. "Stay here. Don't move that leg." Someone will be back for you soon. Carter was already moving to the next casualty before Kowalski could respond. Hendricks sat propped against a tree, both hands pressed to his stomach. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark and steady, soaking through his field jacket. Abdominal wound, potentially catastrophic. Carter knelt beside him, gently moving the hands aside to assess the damage. The wound was clean-edged. A piece of shrapnel had sliced across the lower left quadrant of the abdomen. Bad, very bad, but manageable if he worked fast, and the internal damage wasn't too extensive. "You're the colored medic," Hendricks whispered, his eyes unfocused, his face grey with shock. Even now, bleeding out in a frozen forest, his mind couldn't quite let go of that categorization. "That's right, and you mocked me 2 hours ago. We can discuss that later if you want." Carter's voice was calm, clinical, focused entirely on the task at hand. He opened Hendricks's jacket and shirt, exposing pale skin and the ugly gash across his abdomen. Intestines were visible through the wound, glistening and vulnerable. "Right now, I need you to breathe slow and steady. This is going to hurt quite a bit." Sulfanilamide powder went directly into the wound, a precaution against infection that was standard practice for any penetrating injury. The powder burned like fire when it contacted exposed tissue. Hendricks gasped but didn't cry out, his jaw clenched so tight Carter could see the muscles bunching. Carter packed the wound with gauze, being careful not to push any material into the abdominal cavity, then wrapped the entire midsection tight to hold pressure and protect the exposed tissue. Another morphine syringe marked the time on the man's forehead with a grease pencil. The sounds of groaning led him to 2 more wounded. A private named Sullivan with a mangled hand, 3 fingers severed and bones visible through torn flesh. Carter wrapped it tight, immobilized the entire hand against Sullivan's chest in a sling to prevent movement and reduce bleeding. Morphine administered. Sullivan was in shock, shivering uncontrollably despite the heavy coat he wore. Carter covered him with his own overcoat, sacrificing his warmth for the wounded man's survival. In shock, the body couldn't regulate temperature properly. Hypothermia could set in quickly. The 4th casualty was worse, much worse. Private DeMarco, barely 19 years old, a kid who had grown up in Brooklyn and probably had never been out of New York before joining the service, lay on his back making horrible wet sucking sounds as he struggled to breathe. Blood bubbled from his neck with each desperate attempt at air. Bright red and frothy, shrapnel had torn across the throat and upper chest, lacerating the trachea and surrounding tissue. Carter had practiced this exact scenario dozens of times in training, but training used dummies and pig carcasses from the slaughterhouse, things that didn't have terrified eyes staring at you begging for help. This was a kid from Brooklyn who probably had a girl back home and parents who would get a telegram if Carter couldn't stabilize him. No time for those thoughts now. Focus on the task. Focus on the training. He tilted DeMarco's head back, clearing the airway of blood and debris. The trachea was partially severed but not completely destroyed, a miracle given the amount of damage. Carter packed the external wounds carefully, then used his fingers to feel the internal damage, mapping the injury by touch. The windpipe was compromised, but might hold if he could stop the bleeding into it and position the head properly. He worked with absolute concentration, packing, wrapping, angling DeMarco's head to maximize airflow through the damaged passage, while minimizing blood flow into the lungs. "Breathe slow," he instructed, his voice steady and calm despite the severity of the injury. "Small breaths. Your airway is damaged but open. Small breaths, slow and steady. Don't panic. I've got you." DeMarco's eyes, wide with terror and already starting to glaze with shock, locked onto Carter's face. The horrible sucking sound diminished slightly. The breathing steadied, still labored and wet-sounding, but less desperate, less immediate. Carter stayed with him, monitoring constantly, adjusting the head position, checking the packing until he was certain the situation would hold for at least a little while. Around him, the unhurt members of the column were regrouping, moving like ghosts through the smoke and snow. 7 men remained combat effective out of the original 15. Sergeant Donnelly was dead, killed instantly by the first mortar round. 2 others who had been at the front of the column were also dead, their bodies torn apart by the high explosive rounds. The tactical situation was grim. They were lost in hostile territory, under strength, with 4 seriously wounded who couldn't walk, and probably wouldn't survive being moved roughly. A corporal named Briggs, a nervous man who had somehow become the next senior person by default rather than merit, tried to take charge. His voice was shrill with stress as he addressed the group. "We need to move. Leave the wounded. Send help back when we reach the company position. We can't stay here." Carter looked up from DeMarco, his hand still steadying the man's head in the precise position needed to keep the airway open. "These men will die without constant care. DeMarco needs repositioning every few minutes or he'll drown in his own blood. Hendricks could hemorrhage internally without monitoring. You want to leave them? You're signing their death warrants." "We don't have a choice," Briggs insisted, his voice rising. "We can't carry 4 wounded through hostile territory. It's suicide for all of us. We have to think about the mission." Before Carter could respond, before he could point out that abandoning wounded was against every regulation and basic human decency, the sound of engines returned. Closer this time, much closer. Through the trees, maybe 200 yards north, shapes moved through the snow. Vehicles, infantry walking alongside them. A full German patrol drawn by the mortar fire to investigate the results and possibly capture survivors. The able-bodied Americans froze, weapons half raised, fear etched on their faces. 7 rifles against what looked like at least 20 German soldiers supported by armored vehicles. The math was brutally simple. They were outgunned, outpositioned, and about to be overrun if they stayed. Briggs made his decision quickly, motivated more by fear than strategy. "Fall back. Everyone, move south, stay low, move fast. Go, go, go." The 6 other ambulatory soldiers began to retreat, moving fast and quiet through the trees, using the terrain and limited visibility to cover their withdrawal. Briggs paused for just a moment, looking back at Carter and the wounded men spread across the clearing. "You coming?" Carter looked at Kowalski, unconscious now from morphine and shock, at Hendricks, his face grey but his eyes still aware and pleading, at Sullivan shivering under the overcoat, his mangled hand cradled against his chest, at DeMarco, whose breathing depended on Carter's hands maintaining the exact angle and position that kept his compromised airway open. 4 men who would die if left alone. 4 men who had mocked him just hours before, dismissed his training, treated him as less than human based solely on the color of his skin. 4 men who represented everything wrong with the segregated military and the segregated society that had created it. The choice should have been difficult. It should have required deliberation, weighing of options, consideration of consequences. It wasn't. "No," Carter said simply, his voice calm. "I'm staying." Briggs stared at him for a heartbeat, something like respect flickering across his face before fear reasserted itself. He nodded once and disappeared into the forest. The sound of retreating footsteps faded quickly, absorbed by the snow and trees. Carter and the wounded were alone. The German patrol approached with methodical efficiency, the kind that spoke of experience and professional competence. Carter could hear their voices now, speaking in clipped German commands that he couldn't understand but recognized as tactical communication. Officers directing men, establishing fields of fire, securing the perimeter. He had perhaps 3 minutes, maybe less, before they reached the clearing. 4 wounded men and 1 medic against a reinforced patrol. The situation was impossible by any reasonable measure. But Carter's training had covered this scenario too. Not how to fight it, because fighting was hopeless, but how to survive it. Rules of warfare, Geneva Convention, treatment of medical personnel and wounded. He moved quickly among the wounded, gathering rifles and piling them in plain sight 20 feet away from the casualties, making it clear they were surrendered weapons. He removed his own pistol belt, laying it with the rifles. Then he took a white undershirt from his pack and tied it to a broken branch, propping it upright where it could be clearly seen against the dark forest. "Listen to me, all of you," he said quietly but urgently, moving from one wounded man to the next, making sure each heard and understood. "When they get here, don't move. Don't speak unless spoken to. We're wounded and surrendering. We're non-combatants under the Geneva Convention, that's all we are. Understand?" Kowalski, face gray with pain and morphine, but still conscious enough to register the situation, managed to nod. Hendricks whispered, his voice barely audible, "You're staying? After what we said? Why?" "Because you can't move, and I can keep you alive." Carter returned to DeMarco, adjusting his position one more time, checking the packing around the neck wound. "Now be quiet." The Germans appeared like ghosts materializing from the winter forest, field-gray uniforms blending with the snow and shadows. 23 soldiers, Carter counted automatically, plus 2 light-armored vehicles that stayed on a nearby trail, their engines idling. They wore the field gray of regular army units, not the camouflage smocks of elite formations or the black uniforms of more specialized units. Their weapons were trained on the cluster of Americans with professional discipline, fingers on triggers, but not tense, ready but controlled. They approached cautiously, alert for ambush or resistance, spreading out to cover multiple angles. An officer stepped forward from the group, a lieutenant perhaps 25 years old, with hard eyes that had seen too much and a face weathered beyond his years. He carried himself with the confidence of experience, someone who had been doing this long enough to know what he was looking at. He surveyed the scene methodically, the wounded men, the surrendered weapons piled conspicuously in plain sight, the makeshift white flag. His gaze settled on Carter, the only American still mobile, kneeling beside DeMarco with blood-covered hands and an expression of calm determination. "Americana?" the officer asked, his voice neutral, neither hostile nor friendly. "Yes, sir. American medical personnel. These men are wounded and need care." Carter kept his voice steady, professional, meeting the officer's eyes directly. He had no idea if the German spoke English, but tone and body language were universal. He was trying to communicate, not a threat, not a combatant, just a medic doing his job. The lieutenant's expression remained neutral as he processed this information. Then, in accented but clear English, "You are surrendered. We're non-combatants, wounded and medical personnel. We claim protection under the Geneva Convention." Carter spoke carefully, using the formal language he had been taught would carry weight. Rules of war, international law, the thin veneer of civilization that supposedly governed even this organized savagery. The German officer considered this, his jaw working slightly as he thought. Then he spoke rapidly in German to his men. Several moved forward, weapons still ready, checking the surrendered rifles and searching the perimeter. Others fanned out, establishing a defensive position. One soldier, wearing the Red Cross armband of a medic over his uniform sleeve, approached cautiously and knelt beside DeMarco. The German medic, though thin man in his 30s with the weathered face of a veteran and careful hands, examined Carter's work with professional interest. His eyebrows rose slightly in what might have been surprise or respect. He looked at Carter and said something in German, then seemed to realize the language barrier. In halting, heavily accented English, he asked, "You are trained?" "Medical trained. Combat medical training, 16 weeks, Fort Sam, Houston, Texas." Carter didn't know why he gave the specific details, but something in the other medic's professional manner prompted it. One medical professional to another, nationality temporarily irrelevant. The German medic, whose name would turn out to be Erich, nodded slowly, some understanding passing between them. He moved to examine the other wounded, checking each in turn. Kowalski's tourniquet and bandaging, Hendricks' abdominal dressing and the careful packing that protected exposed tissue, Sullivan's immobilized hand. Each time his expression showed the same faint surprise, the recognition that the work was professional and competent. When he returned to the German officer, they had a brief, low conversation in rapid German. The lieutenant approached Carter again, and something had shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of professional respect. "Your men are well treated. You have good training, yes?" "Yes, sir." "Our medic says your work is good. Very good. This man," he pointed to DeMarco, whose breathing was still labored but steady, "he should be dead. Bad wound. You keep him alive, yes?" "I'm trying to, sir." The German officer seemed to consider something, his jaw working as he made some kind of internal calculation. Then he made a decision, speaking quickly. "We have wounded also. 3 men, in vehicle. One is bad, very bad. Hauptmann, captain, is badly wounded. Our medic cannot help him. He will die without better care. The officer paused and Carter saw something shift in his eyes. Not quite desperation, but a kind of controlled urgency. You will look at him. You will use your training to help him. Now, this is not request. It wasn't a request. It was an order from an armed enemy officer. But there was something else there too, a kind of desperate hope that transcended the uniforms and opposing sides. 2 soldiers helped Carter to his feet and escorted him toward one of the armored vehicles. As they walked, the surreal nature of the situation crystallized in Carter's mind with absolute clarity. 2 hours ago, he had been mocked for his medical training. Now wounded men on both sides needed that training to survive. The color of his skin, the uniform he wore, the flag he served, suddenly mattered less than the skills in his hands. The German wounded were in the back of a half-track, sheltered from the snow by a canvas cover, but still exposed to the brutal cold. 2 had relatively minor wounds by the standards of what Carter had already treated. One soldier with a shoulder injury, the joint dislocated and the surrounding tissue torn. Another with a leg wound similar to Kowalski's, though not as severe. The third man was the crisis that had prompted the German lieutenant's order. Hauptmann Weber, a captain and evidently the patrol commander's superior officer, lay on a stretcher covered with blankets. He had been riding in the lead vehicle when it triggered an American anti-personnel mine. The explosion had thrown him clear but left devastating injuries. His right leg was mangled below the knee, bone fragments visible through torn flesh, the foot attached only by strips of skin and tendon. More critically, a large piece of shrapnel protruded from his lower back, just above the left hip. The metal shard was perhaps 4 inches long, embedded at an angle Carter couldn't immediately determine. Carter examined the wounds with clinical detachment, his mind automatically cataloguing the damage and required interventions, running through procedures learned in training and practiced until they became instinct. The leg was bad, catastrophic really, but survivable with proper treatment and likely amputation. The back wound was the real killer. The shrapnel was lodged dangerously close to the spine, possibly in or near major blood vessels. The femoral artery and vein ran through that area. The inferior vena cava wasn't far away. Removing the shrapnel incorrectly could cause massive hemorrhage that would kill Weber in minutes. Leaving it could lead to infection, paralysis, or slow internal bleeding. Erich, the German medic, had done what he could with limited training and supplies. The leg was tourniqueted to control bleeding, reducing blood flow, but also risking the entire limb if left too long. The back wound was covered with gauze and bandages, but that was purely protective. Erich lacked the advanced training needed for this level of trauma. His face showed the strain of watching his commanding officer slowly deteriorate, while being unable to provide adequate help. "How long ago was he wounded?" Carter asked, checking Weber's pulse at the wrist. Thready and rapid, exactly what he expected. The lieutenant who had followed translated for Erich. The answer came back in German, then translated. 3 hours and 10 minutes. 3 hours of blood loss, shock, and declining vital signs. Carter checked Weber's pulse again, then his respiration. Weak, rapid pulse, shallow breathing, skin cold and clammy despite the blankets. Classic presentation of hypovolemic shock, the body shutting down non-essential systems to preserve core function. Without intervention, Weber might last another hour, maybe 90 minutes. Maybe less. Carter looked at the lieutenant directly. "I can try to help him, but I need supplies, more than what I have in my bag. Plasma, if you have it, sterile instruments for extraction, more morphine and sulfanilamide powder, proper bandaging materials." The lieutenant barked orders in rapid German. Soldiers scrambled, returning with a larger medical kit from the vehicles and several additional supplies scavenged from other sources. Carter inventoried quickly, laying out what he needed on a clean cloth. German supplies, but medical gear was relatively standardized across all armies. Instruments were instruments, bandages were bandages. He found what he needed or close enough substitutes. "I'll need assistance. Someone with steady hands who can follow instructions precisely and who won't panic." Carter looked at Erich. "Will you help? I'll walk you through it step by step." The German medic nodded, relief visible on his weathered face despite the situation. For the next hour, nationality became irrelevant, a meaningless abstraction. Two medics worked to save a life, communicating in broken English and improvised sign language, their hands moving in the universal vocabulary of emergency medicine that transcended borders and politics. Carter started with the leg, the more straightforward of the two major injuries. The tourniquet had saved Weber's life initially, but couldn't stay on indefinitely without risking permanent damage or necessitating amputation. He loosened it carefully while Eric held pressure on the major bleed points, checking blood flow. The leg was a lost cause below mid-shin, the bones shattered beyond field repair, but he might be able to save the knee and upper portion. He cleaned the wound as best he could with limited water, removing obviously non-viable tissue and bone fragments that could cause infection. The process was grim work, made worse by the cold that made his fingers stiff. He packed the wound thoroughly with sulfanilamide powder, then wrapped it in layers of clean gauze and bandaging. The goal wasn't perfection or even proper healing. The goal was stabilization, preventing infection and further blood loss until Weber could reach a proper surgical facility with operating rooms and trained surgeons. The back wound required more delicate work and carried more risk. Carter positioned Weber carefully on his side, exposing the embedded shrapnel. It had entered at an angle, the metal dark against pale skin. He palpated the area around the entry point extremely carefully, feeling for the arterial pulse, mapping the geography of the wound by touch. His fingers found the femoral pulse several inches away, strong enough. The angle of entry suggested the fragment had missed the spine by perhaps half an inch, maybe less. Incredible luck in an unlucky situation. "I'm going to remove it," Carter explained to Eric, demonstrating with gestures to reinforce the words. "When I pull, you must be ready with pressure immediately, here and here." He indicated the precise points where bleeding would likely occur based on the angle and depth of penetration. "The moment it's free, press hard with gauze pads. Do you understand?" Yes, I understand. I am ready." Eric's hands were already positioned, holding sterile gauze pads, his face set with concentration. Carter gripped the protruding metal with forceps from the German medical kit, the instrument feeling slightly different from American equipment but functionally identical. He applied steady, even pressure, withdrawing at the exact angle of entry, smooth and controlled. No jerking, no twisting. Straight out. The shard was larger than he had estimated, nearly 4 inches of jagged steel that had somehow missed every critical structure. Blood welled immediately as it came free, bright red and pulsing. Eric's hands were there instantly, pressing gauze pads exactly where Carter had indicated. Together they held pressure for a full 3 minutes, neither speaking, both focused entirely on the task. Carter counted seconds in his head, estimating blood loss, monitoring for signs of arterial bleeding that would require different intervention. The bleeding slowed gradually to a manageable seep, indicating they had been lucky. No major vessel had been compromised. Carter packed the wound cavity with more sulfanilamide powder and bandaged it in multiple layers, creating compression to maintain hemostasis while protecting the wound from contamination. He used significantly more bandaging material than strictly necessary, building layers of pressure that would hopefully maintain themselves for several hours. When they finished, both medics sat back, exhausted. Carter's hands shook slightly from the adrenaline come-down and the cold. He looked at his work with a critical eye, seeing the imperfections and shortcuts forced by the circumstances, but also seeing something that had a reasonable chance of keeping Weber alive until he reached proper medical care. Weber remained unconscious throughout the procedures, which had been a mercy. The morphine Eric had administered earlier, combined with shock, kept him under. Carter started an IV line with plasma from the German supplies, finding a vein in the arm and inserting the needle with practiced ease. He hung the bottle from a hook inside the half-track, letting gravity do the work of replacing lost volume. The fluid would help counter shock and stabilize blood pressure, buying time. The German lieutenant had watched the entire procedure in silence, standing at the back of the half-track despite the cold. Now he stepped forward, studying his superior officer's bandaged form with an expression Carter couldn't quite read. When he turned to Carter, something profound had shifted in his eyes. "Danke," he said quietly, the single German word carrying weight. Then in English, Thank you. You save his life, maybe. You did not have to do this. You could refuse, could do bad job, let him die, but you do good work. Why? Carter was too tired for philosophical discussions. Because he was wounded, and I'm trained to help wounded men, that's all. The lieutenant studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He made another decision, speaking rapidly in German to his men. Then to Carter, "You're wounded. We take them also. You come with us, all of you. There is field hospital 8 kilometers west. German hospital, but they will care for all. American, German, does not matter to doctors." It was an extraordinary offer that went well beyond the Geneva Convention's minimum requirements. Technically, as prisoners, the Americans could be left with minimal care or marched to a POW collection point. Instead, the German officer was offering the same medical evacuation that his own wounded would receive, transport to a proper medical facility rather than field treatment and abandonment. "Why?" Carter asked, echoing the lieutenant's earlier question. The lieutenant seemed to search for words, his English good but not quite adequate for what he wanted to express. "You are enemy, yes. Our country's fight. But also you are medic. You help our Hauptmann when you could refuse, could let him die. This..." He gestured at the half-track, at Carter's exhausted posture, at the careful bandaging visible on Weber's form. "This is honorable. We are soldiers, yes, but we do not forget honor. You show honor. We show honor." Within 30 minutes, both groups of wounded were loaded into the German vehicles with surprising care and efficiency. Carter found himself in the half-track with Weber and the other German casualties, while his American patients were distributed among the other vehicles with German medics detailed to monitor them. Eric sat across from Carter, and as the vehicle jolted into motion along the frozen forest trail, he offered Carter a canteen of water and a piece of hard black bread. They ate in silence, two medics who had faced death together and won, at least for today. The ideologies that had sent millions to fight and die seemed distant and absurd in that moment. There was only the universal struggle against injury and death, the eternal effort to preserve life in the face of mechanized violence and industrial-scale killing. The field hospital turned out to be a repurposed Belgian farmhouse, expanded with multiple tents and staffed by a mixture of German medical personnel and apparently conscripted local doctors. When the vehicles arrived, Carter's patients were taken immediately to surgery, along with the German wounded. No distinction was made based on nationality, only severity of injury. Triage was universal. Treat the worst first, then work down the list. A German doctor, an older man with silver hair and the precise bearing of a peacetime surgeon, examined Carter's fieldwork on each patient methodically. He said nothing at first, just moved through assessments with professional efficiency, nodding occasionally, his expression neutral. When he finished reviewing all 7 patients, he approached Carter directly. "You are the American medic, yes? The one who treated both groups?" His English was excellent, barely accented. "Yes, sir. I am Dr. Hoffman. I have been surgeon for 28 years, first in private practice, then in the medical corps for this conflict. Your fieldwork is excellent, particularly on the Hauptmann, the back wound especially. Very precise, very careful. Where did you train?" "Fort Sam Houston, sir. Texas. 16 weeks combat medical program." Hoffman nodded thoughtfully, his expression showing professional respect. "The American Combat Medical Program. Yes, I have read about it in medical journals before the conflict. Very modern, very practical, very focused on field conditions rather than ideal scenarios. Your training shows clearly in your work." He paused, then added with complete sincerity, "You should know that all of your patients will likely survive. The abdominal case will require careful monitoring for peritonitis and internal bleeding, but the initial treatment was sound. You saved 4 lives today, perhaps 5 with the Hauptmann. That is significant work under any circumstances, but especially under the conditions you described." Carter felt the weight of the day settle onto his shoulders, like a physical thing. He had been operating on training and adrenaline for hours, functioning in crisis mode where you don't think, you just do. Now, with the immediate crisis past and his patients in proper care, Exhaustion flooded through him. "Thank you, sir. You will rest now. There is a room in the cellar where we keep medical prisoners separate from combatants. You will be safe there, warm, with food. In the morning we will discuss your situation and what happens next." The cellar room was actually more comfortable than many places Carter had slept during his military service. A proper cot with actual mattress and blankets, not just a shelter half on cold ground. A small stove that kept the underground space tolerably warm, maybe 50 degrees, but that felt tropical compared to the forest. A bucket for water, another for waste. Basic but adequate. He collapsed onto the cot and fell asleep immediately, still wearing his blood-stained uniform, his mind too exhausted for dreams. He woke to voices and footsteps on the floor above, the sound of normal hospital activity. Daylight showed through a high, narrow window, weak winter sun that barely illuminated the small cellar. Carter checked his watch, surprised to see it was 7:30 in the morning. He had slept nearly 11 hours straight, the sleep of complete exhaustion. The door opened and Dr. Hoffman entered, carrying a tray with bread, cheese and ersatz coffee that smelled almost nothing like real coffee but was hot. "Good morning, Private Carter. I thought you might be hungry." Carter accepted the food gratefully, suddenly aware that he hadn't eaten since the previous morning, nearly 24 hours ago. As he ate, Hoffman sat on the room's single chair and regarded him thoughtfully, the way a professor might study an interesting student. "I have spoken with the wounded American soldiers during rounds this morning, the ones you treated. They told me interesting things about yesterday." Carter said nothing, just continued eating the bread and cheese, which despite being rough German rations tasted better than anything he could remember. "They said you were mocked yesterday morning, called names, treated badly because of your skin color. They said you had every reason to leave them when the Germans came, to save yourself and let them face their fate, but you stayed. Why?" Hoffman's tone was genuinely curious, not accusatory. Carter set down the coffee cup and met the doctor's eyes directly. "Because they were wounded, and I had the training to help. That's the only reason that mattered. That's the only reason that should ever matter." Hoffman nodded slowly, something like satisfaction in his expression, a simple answer. Perhaps the truest answers always are. He stood pacing the small room with his hands behind his back, a lecturer's posture. "This conflict has shown me many things, Private Carter. I have seen the worst of what humans can do to each other, the absolute worst, things that make me ashamed to be part of this species. But also, sometimes, rarely, I see the best, acts of courage and compassion that remind me why this profession matters." He stopped pacing and looked at Carter directly. "Yesterday you demonstrated something that war often destroys, the ability to see past the surface, past the uniform and the flag and the propaganda, to what truly matters, the fundamental human need for care when injured." He paused. "The men who mocked you wish to speak with you. Will you see them?" Carter hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." Hoffman left and returned moments later with Kowalski, who hobbled on crutches, his wounded leg heavily bandaged and splintered. The private's face was pale and drawn, but his eyes were clear and focused. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, unable to meet Carter's gaze at first. "I wanted to say." Kowalski started, then stopped. He took a deep breath and tried again. "I was wrong. What I said in the truck, how I treated you, the things I said, it was all wrong, and I'm ashamed of it." He finally looked up, meeting Carter's eyes with visible effort. "You saved my life after how I was to you. You still saved my life, did everything right, treated me like I mattered. I don't know how to even begin to thank you or apologize properly." "You don't need to explain or thank me," Carter interrupted gently. "Just remember the lesson. People are more than what they look like. Judge them by what they do, by their character and their actions, not by categories someone else assigned to them." Kowalski nodded, tears forming in his eyes. "I will. I swear to God I will. I'm going to be different. Better, I promise you that." Hendricks came next, moving carefully with his abdominal wound still healing under professional care. His apology was shorter but equally sincere, his shame visible in every word and gesture. "My father taught me wrong. I see that now. I'm sorry for what I said, for how I thought. You're twice the man I am, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of what you did." Then Sullivan, with his mangled hand, now properly set and splinted, the fingers that could be saved carefully aligned and bandaged. He couldn't stop crying as he tried to apologize, the words coming out broken and raw. The last visitor was DeMarco, still weak but breathing normally. His throat wound properly sutured and dressed. The surgery had been successful, Hoffman had reported, with minimal permanent damage expected. Carter's field treatment had prevented aspiration and kept the airway patent long enough for proper intervention. "My ma always taught me to judge people by their character, by what they do when things are hard," DeMarco said quietly, his voice still raspy from the throat injury. "Somewhere along the way I forgot that lesson. You reminded me in the hardest possible way. You saved my life when I didn't deserve it, when I had been cruel to you. Thank you, Carter. For my life, yeah, but also for that reminder, for showing me what real character looks like." After they left, Carter sat alone with his thoughts, processing the encounters. The war would continue, would rage on for months more. He would eventually be transferred to a POW camp, would spend time behind wire until liberation or exchange. The men he saved would return to their units, would fight again, would carry the memory of this encounter into whatever came next. But something had shifted, something fundamental and permanent. In one forest clearing, under mortar fire and enemy guns, the arbitrary divisions that separated humans had dissolved in the face of more fundamental realities. Bleeding wounds and desperate need, professional skill and moral courage. The color of the hands that stop the bleeding doesn't matter when your life is pumping out onto frozen ground. Only the skill in those hands and the will to use them. Weeks later, through the strange channels of wartime communication that somehow persisted even between enemies, Carter learned that Hauptmann Weber had recovered sufficiently to return to duty. The German captain had sent a message through Dr. Hoffman, a simple thank you, and a statement that he would carry the memory of the American medic's professionalism and skill for the rest of his life. He would tell his children and grandchildren about the soldier who saved his life when he could have let him die, who saw past uniforms and flags to fundamental human dignity. The Battle of the Bulge raged on for weeks after that December day, the largest and bloodiest battle American forces would fight in the European theater. Thousands died in the frozen Ardennes, cut down by bullets and shells and the merciless cold. But in one small corner of that vast conflict, 9 men survived who should have died. 4 Americans and 5 Germans, saved by the skill and courage of one medic who refused to let hatred and prejudice determine his actions. When liberation came in April of 1945, Carter was repatriated through Switzerland in a prisoner exchange. He returned to a segregated America, where his uniform meant little, and his skin color meant everything in determining where he could live, work, and eat. But he carried with him the knowledge that in the most desperate circumstances, when everything artificial was stripped away, he had proven what he always knew in his heart, that skill, courage, and compassion transcended all the arbitrary boundaries that humans construct. The men he saved stayed in contact after the conflict ended, maintaining correspondence despite the geographic separation. Kowalski, Hendricks, Sullivan, and DeMarco all testified to what Carter had done, writing letters and making statements, pushing for recognition that was painfully slow to come in an America still deeply segregated. In 1948, after years of effort and advocacy, he finally received the Bronze Star for Valor, presented at a quiet ceremony in Philadelphia, attended by the 4 men whose lives he had saved. The citation mentioned his courage under fire and his exceptional medical skill that saved multiple lives in desperate circumstances, though it said nothing about the racism he had overcome or the moral courage required to help those who had mocked him. Carter went on to medical school on the GI Bill, one of the first African-American students accepted to the University of Pennsylvania's medical program. He became one of the first black surgeons in Pennsylvania, practicing for 40 years and training a generation of doctors in the precise, calm approach to trauma care that he had learned in Texas and perfected in a frozen Belgian forest. His students, regardless of their race or background, learned from his example: when someone is bleeding, you stop the bleeding. Everything else is secondary. In his office throughout those decades, among the diplomas and certificates and awards, he kept a photograph from December 1944. It had been taken at that German field hospital before the Americans were separated from their German captors and moved to POW camps. The photo showed 4 American soldiers and 1 medic, all looking exhausted and relieved, and somehow fundamentally changed by what they had experienced. Kowalski, Hendricks, Sullivan, DeMarco, and Carter, standing together despite everything that should have kept them apart. Below the photograph, a simple caption he had written himself in careful script: "The day we learned that healing has no color." Dr. Hoffman also survived the conflict, returning to civilian practice in Hamburg after the surrender. He established one of Germany's first integrated medical training programs in the post-war years, accepting students regardless of background or origin, motivated in part by what he had witnessed that December day. In his memoirs, published in 1967, he wrote extensively about the American medic who treated friend and foe with equal skill and compassion, calling it one of the most profound lessons he learned in 6 years of conflict. He used Carter's example in his teaching, asking his students to consider what medicine meant when stripped of politics and prejudice. The German lieutenant who made the decision to take all the wounded to the hospital, whose name Carter later learned was Lieutenant Klaus Bergmann, also survived the war. In correspondence with Carter that began in the 1960s and continued for decades, he wrote that the December day in the Ardennes had challenged everything he thought he knew about enemies and allies, about worth and value measured by nationality or race. He spent his post-war years working for international medical relief organizations, trying in some small way to build what the conflict had destroyed, motivated by the memory of 2 medics working together to save lives regardless of uniform. But perhaps the most significant and lasting impact was on the 4 men Carter saved. They returned home changed in fundamental ways, having confronted their own prejudices in the most direct manner possible. They became advocates for integration and civil rights, speaking at churches and schools and community organizations about the medic who saved their lives despite having every reason to let them die, who showed them what character really meant when tested by the hardest circumstances. "He showed us what we should have known all along," Kowalski told audiences for decades after, his voice still carrying the shame of his earlier prejudice, but also the conviction of someone truly changed. That character isn't about the color of your skin or where you're from or what church you attend. It's about what you do when everything is on the line, and no one would blame you for walking away. James Carter stayed in that forest when he could have run. He stayed and saved us, saved all of us, American and German alike. And in doing that, he saved more than our lives. He saved our souls too, showed us how to be better than we were. The story spread slowly at first, told in small circles and local communities, then wider as the men who had been there shared it with anyone who would listen. It became one of the countless small examples of humanity persisting in the midst of mechanized death, a reminder that even in the worst circumstances imaginable, individuals could choose compassion over hatred, service over self-preservation, dignity over revenge. For Carter himself, the memory remained both painful and proud throughout his long life. Painful because of what it revealed about his own country's treatment of its citizens, the casual cruelty of segregation that persisted for decades after the conflict ended. Proud because of what it proved about the power of skill and dedication to transcend even the deepest prejudices when lives hung in the balance. In interviews late in his life, conducted by historians and journalists interested in preserving the stories of the conflict's veterans, he was often asked why he stayed in that forest, why he didn't take the chance to escape when the German patrol arrived and his fellow soldiers fled. His answer was always the same, simple and direct, delivered in the calm voice that his students and patients had known for decades. "Because I was a medic, and they were wounded. That's all that mattered in that moment. That's all that should ever matter when someone needs help, and you have the ability to provide it." James Carter died in 2006 at the age of 84, surrounded by family and former students and colleagues. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people from all walks of life, including several elderly men who had traveled from across the country, despite their age and infirmity. They were the survivors and descendants of the men Carter saved that December day in Belgium, there to pay final respects to the medic who taught them that healing recognizes no boundaries of race or nationality, or any other human categorization. The lesson of that day in the Ardennes remains profoundly relevant decades later. In a world still divided by arbitrary categories of race, religion, nationality, and countless other distinctions, the story of James Carter stands as a quiet testament to a simpler and more fundamental truth, that when faced with suffering, the only response that honors our shared humanity is to help, regardless of who is suffering or why they are suffering, or what they have done to us. The conflict ended in May 1945 with unconditional surrender, but its lessons continue to resonate through the decades that followed. In every emergency room and battlefield aid station, in every moment when trained hands work to save a life regardless of the circumstances, Carter's legacy persists quietly. Not because he was exceptional in his compassion, though he was brave beyond measure, but because he was ordinary in the best possible way, a skilled professional who saw past hatred and prejudice to the fundamental human need for care. In the end, that frozen forest in Belgium became a classroom where 9 men learned that survival depends not on the prejudices we carry into crisis, but on the willingness to set them aside when lives hang in the balance. 4 men who mocked a black soldier begged him to save their lives 2 hours later. And he did, proving that the true measure of character isn't found in how we treat those who respect us, but in how we respond to those who don't, in how we act when tested by the hardest circumstances imaginable. That is the historical reality that transcends the specific details of December 1944. Not just the grand strategies and massive campaigns that fill history books, but these small moments when individual choices reveal what humanity can be at its best. James Carter made his choice in that clearing, knowing full well what his fellow soldiers had said to him, how they had treated him, what they represented about the society that had raised them. He chose to stay anyway, chose to use his skills to save lives, regardless of whether those lives had shown him respect or dignity. And in making that choice, he demonstrated a truth that transcends the specific circumstances of that winter day in Belgium. We are, all of us, more than the categories others assign to us. We are defined instead by our actions in moments of crisis, by our willingness to use our gifts in service of others, even when others have given us every reason to do otherwise, even when walking away would be completely justified and understandable. That lesson, learned in blood and snow and desperation, remains as vital now as it was on that day when a medic stayed with the wounded and proved that healing truly has no color, no nationality, no boundary except the limits of skill and will. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.